You're on 121.5, the emergency frequency.
Welcome to the 21.5 Show, a podcast for professional pilots by professional pilots. Join Dylan and Max, both with experience in flight instruction, the airlines, and business aviation, as they talk to a variety of industry experts, share stories, and have a little fun along the way.
We're back. It's the 21.5 Professional Pilots Podcast, the show for the pros. With two pros here. We're just enjoying a little West Coast rap for our intro, Max. We've been talking about circling minimums. We've been talking about stabilized approach and, all these communicating.
Are we going to get into
principal,
Biggie versus Tupac now? Is that what you're saying?
Meanwhile, we've gotten more email about the rims, keeping them 20 versus 10s.
It's keeping them clean.
Keeping them clean, yeah. We've got a million emails about that. And all these important topics we're covering.
The highest user engagement or listener engagement is on.
Exactly. And one user chastised us because he's like, you're playing West Coast rap music as your intro and you don't even know. So, yeah. Meanwhile, the minimums are changing in Aspen and, planes are crashing left and right. And
God, I know. Actually, I flew into Truckee recently. That was really eye-opening because having never flown in there and then us analyzing this accident and then flying in there, I'll tell you what, the more challenging approach is landing on 2.9. Mm-hmm. That's no joke there.
Just because of there's terrain on final, right?
Yeah, way on final. And you can't come in at a square base because you come over like this little dip in the hills on a modified base and you swing in. I came higher from further out and on a very aggressive descent profile, which you can get away with in the straight wing citation. But we did it twice in 2 days or whatever. So a couple of good looks at it. And I'll tell you what, having flown in there, if you told me somebody crashed, I would have immediately said, oh, they were flying to 2.9. And in limited visibility, that could be very sketchy.
So is it kind of like for any of our listeners that have flown into Scottsdale where we've got the mountains off in the distance, is it that tight? Tighter?
Yeah.
For 2.9?
Yes.
Wow.
And higher mountains, like from an AGL perspective. From the airport.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Jeez.
It's pretty aggressive. And so it's one of those things, you look at the official data and there's really nothing that says what to do. So, we just kind of take a look at it and we do what we do. But
dive.
But
were you flapped out when you were coming down?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And I was doing the standard Batiste call-outs. Then you go into the FBO, and I'm sure if we did some more research on the website, which we should have done probably, but then there's a charted visual procedure. Like they made their own little chart, and it has like 5-letter identifiers you can put in the FMS, the whole deal. But it's just not. I didn't see it in the charts. So anyway, that was interesting. I took a couple pictures. I'll show you.
So I had said, Truckee maybe doesn't come up as much as Aspen, Telluride, Sun Valley, some of these other airports. Would you put it on that same level? If there was with the wind and the shifting wind?
Is it an airport that requires more pre-flight planning and attention to than the average one? Absolutely.
Okay.
The approach to 2.9 is way more challenging than the approach to runway 9 and Telluride.
That's not, Well, that's actually not a hard approach.
That's my point. Yeah. Everyone's like, "Oh, Telluride," but that's not that hard of an approach. The 2.9 deal is maybe not quite as hairy as the circle to 2.7 at Telluride, but it's
right there.
It's right there.
Wow,
that's no joke. And I'm sure a lot of people fly and you get used to it, but I'm just saying, I've had a decent amount of experience flying to these mountain airports, and the 2.9 visual was for
right
the first
there.
time was like, wow, that's actually, I told, when we landed, I told Christian, I go, it's not a lot of airplanes. I go, I've flown other airplanes. I would not have been able to do that approach in.
Right.
So that's a big part of it too. Like 737, there's no way, dude. Like we would have overshot the airport by 20 miles. Gulfstream, even then, like
you'd have overshot it over to Reno.
Yeah, I mean, the first approach, and then the second one, we flew more of the
profile
one they suggest, and it's not quite as aggressive. But even then, it's like 4. I think they say it's like 3.9 or something.
So it's right there. Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, we got a ton to get to today. So we've been doing a lot of business aviation content lately, but we got some really good airline stuff coming up in the next few episodes. Starting with today, we're going to be talking about AQP training. This was a really eye-opening conversation for both of us, I think, just about the evolution of training and how it's really come a long way since our initial experiences.
Yeah, for sure. And the way that I learned about AQP, I think, was kind of interesting because we did traditional airline training, the way it had always been done. Then I went to business aviation for a long time. Then I came back to 121. And business aviation essentially is like old school airline training, right? And then I came to the new airline training, and I went through and I was like, that is the way we should be training. Like that makes so much sense. And this is why, you know, we can do thousands of flights a day and have so few mishaps and all this stuff. I'm like, they have this figured out. And then to go back and talk to Sam, it really breaks down that it all,
how they do it. Yeah.
It all kind of connected together for me.
Yeah. So we're excited for that conversation. I think you're going to learn a lot. And, you know, especially for a lot of people that are coming from regionals and corporate over to getting their first job at the majors, this will really give you an idea of what you can expect, how it's different than what maybe you're used to, and how it's better. So
yeah. Is there a downside? Not real apparent if there is.
It didn't sound like
a lot of upsides, even as a pilot and a organization, the whole deal. But anyway,
I don't know.
You'll see.
I mean, if you love high pressure, high stress situations, then maybe you're not going to get that in training. I don't know. All right, we got a ton to get to before we get to that conversation with Sam, though. Coming up first, some reviews, Max. You want to read this one? I don't think you've seen this right here.
Best pilot podcast, ? Yes, I think it might be the best podcast out there for pilots. If you only listen to one, this should be it. No offense to the others, and there are many good ones, but these guys and their resources just bury all the rest. Where was that one? That was from Perry Plus.
Yeah, thanks, Perry Plus.
Was that on
Apple?
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Perry, if you shoot us an email, info@215podcast.com, we will send you some swag. Thanks for writing a review, and we'd love to send any other listeners who can write a review for us. Okay. The new product is in for donations.
Tested and approved.
Fully tested
on a
and
full week at Lake Powell.
Yeah. All right.
With a lot of different types of cans, bottles.
Yes. So tell them, what is it exactly that we've got?
So this is a very versatile vacuum sealed can cooler, which is like the original was like the Yeti one that came out, right? For a beer can,
double walled vacuum sealed. Yeah.
That keeps your
metal
whatever drink cool forever. This one, but then you have like the 12-ounce twist top bottle, and you have the Truly or seltzer thin cans, and you have the 24-ounce can. Oh, no, not
16 ounce.
16 ounce. 16 ounce tall boys.
You got Coors Light
Still
cans.
Coors Light cans. Yeah. This thing will fit all of them with a seal, and it is awesome. Bottles, yeah.
Well,
Topo Chico, anything, dude.
Anything.
It's
I'll
incredible.
post a video on the socials. They're very limited supply. This is like a test run, so we've got a few of them. We got them with the logo, and it also says flexibility is the key to air power on them. So they're pretty cool. We're going to be doing those for a $60 donation to the show. You can go to 215podcast.com, and at the bottom, there's a little donate button, or if you scroll down in the show notes of the podcast, there's a link to it as well. And I'll post some pictures on the socials so you can see they're like a red. They're really cool.
They're really cool. And I know $60 is expensive for a koozie, but they really are cool. And believe it or not, our margin isn't actually as high as you probably think on these things. They are expensive once you have them engraved.
And shipped and everything else.
They are awesome.
Yeah, super cool. Max and I have been testing them extensively, and really hats off to us for launching the koozie right as fall and it cools down, and the worst possible time. Great move, but we love them. All right, gosh, we have so much to get to today. Flight advice is next.
Just quit saying that.
Okay. Flight advice brought to you by our friends at Harvey Watt. You know the advice we're going to give. If you are a professional pilot, you have a floppy piece of paper in your wallet or in your briefcase. And that thing is one of the most important requirements in your bag to bring home the bacon.
You know, what's interesting, while we're on that subject, I had an interesting conversation with the owner of the airplane I formerly flew. So we were talking about it. He's like trying to understand like pilot mentality or something. I'm like, you know, for the biggest thing you could do for retention, I go just give your guys without them having to ask a loss of license insurance policy. I go, honestly, it doesn't cost you that much. And that's a huge deal for pilots. That's one of the reasons I left the guy I flew for. And I said, the other thing too, I said, it's an insurance policy for you. And he goes, what do you mean? I said, well, what are you going to do if your guy goes out on medical for something he has no control over, and he might be off for 6 months or a year or whatever and can't fly. Are you going to can him? He's like, I'm like, that's why it's insurance for you. You don't have to make that decision now. And that was after that, I'm like, wow, that was a really good way to sell that to the principal, because I think it's always most successful in this if you show what's in it for them. And, it's nice that you take care of your pilots and all that stuff, but if you can really show something that's in it for them, which is another really good thing about that insurance.
Absolutely. And if you're at the airlines, odds are your airline probably offers a loss of license package. Harvey Watt pretty much provides all of it for all professional pilots. Make sure you are 100% covered. Protect your family, protect your career, and protect your certificate. All right, on to the flight advice. Until recently, I worked at a small flight school as a part-time flight instructor while I held down a full-time job to provide for my family. Unfortunately, due to increased competition on the field, they let 2 of us part-time instructors go, so now I am no longer working as a pilot. I am only a few months of part-time instruction away from the airlines, and I am at a bit of a crossroads on my path forward. I do intend to go to a regional airline if I can get to 150 or 1,500 hours. I'm working out how to best finish up my hours, but I had an opportunity that might be interesting to your listeners, and I wanted your advice on. Recently, a former student of mine approached me about doing his instrument training over the next few months. However, he and the flight school owner did not see eye to eye over some billing practices that I managed to stay out of when he was finishing up his private license. When I was still working at the flight school, I felt like it was unethical to go outside of the flight school and instruct this student and cut him out of the flight school, as they were how the connection was made, and I still instructed there. The student does not want to give the owner any more of his business, so I said that I wouldn't feel comfortable instructing him in his own airplane on the side. However, now that I am no longer working at the flight school, not by my choice, the student approached me again about completing his instrument training. So my question to you is this. If you were in my shoes, would you instruct this person as an independent CFI? I am leaning towards there being no reasonable conflicts, but wanted the input of some more experienced airmen. I think either way, the flight school owner will be upset, but he has the people skills of a murder hornet. So I am not putting much stock in that. I just want to do the right thing. And that's from Anonymous.
No problem. Next question.
Go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. But it's nice that he actually has a conscience and wanted to seek outside advice to make sure he's doing the right thing. But yeah, you have no obligation, especially if you were laid off.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. If you want to tell the owner that you could maybe be like, hey,
and if
I'm doing it.
Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. If he approaches you and is upset about it, be like, well, maybe you should rethink some of the decisions you've made in the past.
Exactly.
Because obviously there's a demand for the service that I provide. So if it's not going to be through you, I'm going to provide it directly.
And I wouldn't slink around and try and hide it and lie to anybody or do anything like that. Just
honesty is always the best policy.
Absolutely. So good luck on that one. I think find a few clients, provide some customer service. Sounds like there isn't a lot of that on the airport, and you're going to be at the regionals in no time. Wishing you were back flight instructing. Just kidding. All right, mailbag. This rather full mailbag is brought to you by our friends at Advanced Aircrew Academy, Max.
Yes, the Advanced Aircrew Academy, your source for some of the best aviation education available on the internet. If you're a flight department manager and are looking for, or even a charter certificate, director of operations or chief pilot, and looking for a new, innovative, and the best training source, look at Advanced Aircrew Academy.
Their network of subject matter experts is second to none. And actually, I'm going to be interviewing a couple of them at MBAA. They're on some of our panels. So good for me. I'm excited to chat with them again. And I think one of the programs I need to take a course from them is the cold weather course. It's coming up soon. Even in Scottsdale, it's getting a little cooler now.
You should. Let's do it. We should both take it.
Yeah. We should do a little group class. Should be fun. Aircrewacademy.com to check out all of the courses available. Thanks to them for sponsoring the show. All right. First off, got a ton of messages on social media about our interview with Ken.
Ken's the best. What
were we saying? We were texting with somebody and we're like, he's like a real man. I'm chasing like rental car receipts and catering orders and then meanwhile, this guy's like, yeah, I haven't shut the engine off in 48 hours.
That one really resonated with you, didn't it?
I was just like, geez, what am I doing?
My son and I are the only crew.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
We're just like, I'm trying to, book extra points at the Marriott. And then Liz, you remember Liz from Bush Pilot? Yeah. She sent us a picture of this. I'm going to find it. This airplane she's flying VFR around Alaska. I think it's a twin now. She's in the twin. And I don't want to say the wrong type of airplane. I'm going to pull it up really quick here.
The funny thing about aviation is that a lot of people are always wishing they're doing something other than what they're doing. But like I said, even, we're like, oh, what Ken does is so awesome. And then he's like, well, I want to do what you guys do.
Yeah.
It's like, nobody's
always
ever happy.
Yeah.
And it's the airlines versus business aviation. I've always said, if you could take parts from each of them and combine it, you'd have the greatest aviation job in the world. So,
yeah, Liz sent us a picture of a Navajo that she's flying with a panel that looks like it's older than.
Is this Stratus though?
I don't know.
Is on that dash?
It might be time to call her again. Yeah. I don't know. This is the one with the transponder with just like the digits that each digit has a knob.
Digits,
yeah. So I'll post a picture of that. But
I know I look at pictures like that too, and then I go my plane and turn on. I'm like, what have I done?
So shout out to Liz, shout out to Ken, all of the real warriors out there, and shout out to me for putting a breakfast burrito order into the local grocery store for a flight on Wednesday.
Crush.
Yeah.
Good job.
First letter. Hey, Dylan and Max. So it's been a while since you read my email. A bit of a follow-up. I did not, in fact, make it in the air. Fed said no until I did a 12-month-long round of cancer treatment. Boo hiss. Well, fast forward a bit, and it's now almost 23 months since I've been in an airplane. I got my special issuance and medical certificate about 2 weeks ago and had my first sim session yesterday for requal. See Cheesy Pic attached. She sent us a picture of him in the sim. Very happy. I wanted to thank you guys. I had some pretty low moments on my leave, but your podcast helped me get through them. Listening to 21.5 helped me feel like I was still in the biz. Pilots are dorks, and we can probably all agree that we have our own language. You guys and your guests spoke my language. Thank you for that. Meow, Chris.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Chris, we're glad to hear you are back in the cockpit. It's funny, the, twists and turns that can take. We have some other friends that are out right now, and it just takes a long time, and you're powerless to control all this, and that's a lot of this comes back to.
Yeah, it's got to be, I haven't, thank God, been in that situation, but it's got to be the most frustrating. Yeah. I mean, we've known people, too, that actually, I think a lot of people don't realize that you don't necessarily lose your medical, but you can find yourself without a medical and really have nothing wrong with you. And what I mean by that is our friend, case in point, they deferred it. Well, why you defer it? When you go get your medical? When the month it's due, right? So it gets deferred for 6 months. Guess what? You're screwed. And then they say, oh, yeah, everything's fine. Go ahead. Here's your medical. So you never lost your medical. Yeah. You just couldn't get it renewed. And that's got to be mind-boggling.
And it's just so many factors out of your control. So I can't imagine what it was like, Chris, to be out for 23 months, but we're glad you're back.
Good for you.
We're glad you enjoyed the show in the interim, and we're excited to hear about your first trip back in the air. A lot's changed.
Yeah.
There's a new class, Zulu airspace. You better read up on that.
Yeah, I'm really digging the weeds on that one.
Next one. Here you go.
Guys, great show. I was rooting for the emailer who mentioned they were where they tans, but we keep them clean, though. It isn't from the movie Friday as per the clip. It is from a song called React by Redman and Eric Sermon. The first minute should do it. Hope to hear the audio clip on the next show. Given your super early 2000s gangster intro, I thought you guys could have gotten this. Shout out from New York. Stay foliage, Mark. That's funny.
That's what I was referencing in the intro to the show. I know.
And he's right. We listened to the song. Unfortunately, Mark, we cannot play that on here because of the
copy strike.
AI copyright bots that
they'll take down the music.
We don't, as Dylan said, we do not want to get sued by the heirs of Redman.
Okay, now here's a quiz for you. Is Redman dead or alive?
By the context of your statement, I
have no idea. I have no idea. Don't look it up because we're going to receive 50 million emails.
Yeah, I won't waste my time.
Yeah, no technical discussion, but a million people are going to. Oh, I went to the Redman show last week. Yeah, so it was good. So,
but I think that's where it originally came from. But then Friday, and you found a different. Someone else sent us.
Chris sent us a different clip, and then they actually say the same thing. But I think they were referencing the song. I don't know.
No, they tans, but I keep them clean though.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what. All right.
And so,
Okay, I'm
anyways,
glad we got to the bottom of that.
finally got to the bottom of it, and now we'll get a million other emails about it. Okay, speaking of 10s, 20s, and keeping it clean, I guess there's a new Donovan video. Will you, while I get this set up, will you put out a plea to our listeners?
Yeah, listen, we have to talk to this guy. We've reached out. Well, I should say Dylan has reached out, but
from the official account. I mean,
the official account
yeah.
of the podcast. I'm sure he could care less, has no idea. But if anybody else follows Donovan Batiste, if you could just take 5 seconds and send him a DM, just because, hey, respond to the 21.5 show.
We'd love to hear you on the show.
Professional pilots are clamoring to hear what you're all about.
Yeah.
Something. Just send him something, and then maybe he'll sift through his many
if he sees
DMs, I'm
enough.
sure, and all the...
Don't you want to hear us interview this guy?
Yeah. Come on, this guy's the best. So help us out. Send him a message. We'd really like to get this guy on the show. And
I'll have a link to his profile in the show notes, so you can just one simple click, send him a message. Here you go. Here's the latest video.
Coming down sideways, sitting sideways, boys in the days. Hey, on the Sunday night, we might bang Frankie Beverly and Mays.
What song is that from?
Sight picture looking good, baby. Come up out of that slip right now. Too red, too white. We all right. Too white, too red. We not going to be dead. You know what I mean? Come on down, baby.
He's doing a no-flap landing.
We in that thing with no flaps.
Oh, thank you, Dylan.
Flaps inoperable. We still moving. We still thanging that thing. Airspeed looking lovely.
Welcome to 3F Kilo frequency change approved.
Because we on the runway looking lovely. Ground effect, baby. We in ground effect, baby. We in ground effect, baby. We in ground effect, baby. Just riding that thing. Man, get up out of here, man. Flaps inoperable.
When he said get up out of here, man, I think he pushed the carburetor heat in. I think that's what he was talking to. Because he was doing
it wasn't a touch and go?
I think it was. And he was pushing the carb heat in as it was like adding power. Get up out of here, man. We got to talk to this guy.
Yeah, we got to get this guy on. Help us out.
Oh, my gosh. All right. Thank you, Donovan, for the gift that keeps on giving for aviation. Okay. On to the main event. AQP with Sam. Here we go. We are really honored to have Sam joining us today. Sam is a retired pilot from American Airlines, as well as an expert on AQP training. He's worked in developing AQP programs. He's studied it academically. A wealth of knowledge here to explain AQP to us. So welcome to the program, Sam.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Sam, let's start with the basics. AQP, what does it stand for?
AQP stands for the Advanced Qualification Program. And what it is, it's billed as an alternative method to 121 training and checking for 121 airlines. You can use it for 135 and Part 142 schools. I think it's probably, in my opinion, one of the best innovations that the FAA has come up with. It's been around since around 1990, and most of the major airlines and I'd say all of the regional airlines, or most of the regional airlines, and all of the major airlines are using AQP right now.
Okay. So it's almost like airline training 2.0 in a way. The better version.
I guess you could call it that.
Yeah.
You could call it that.
So,
Let me just give you a little bit of a lead up if I could. I got to start off
Sure.
with a trivia question.
Oh.
What's significant about 1959? Way before you guys were born. You were still a gleam in your parents' eye.
I don't know.
All right. Well, it's the dawn of the jet age, And
that was the 707,
prior,
right?
yeah, the 707, the DC-8 rather, So prior to that, there were a lot of human factors accidents. Okay. There was a lot, design issues. There's a reason why the landing gear handle is shaped like a wheel and the flap handle is shaped like a flap. And there were a lot of accidents. And after 1959, when the jet age came about, we started seeing a lot more accidents that were contributed to human factors. Okay. So there were some significant accidents. And I just kind of want to, set the stage a little bit so I could segue into it. There were some significant human factors accidents that started the whole concept of looking into CRM. Eastern 401, 1972, L-1011 crashed into the Everglades. The problem was a burnout light bulb where the crew was totally focused. You probably researched this, right? The crew totally focused on trying to solve the problem, and no one was flying the airplane. In fact, the controller saw the altitude decreasing and called out Eastern 401, how's it going out there? And they said, well, it's going fine. And they wound up, crashing and they had a CFIT accident. United 173, Portland, Oregon, kind of the same thing. They had a same gear problem, and they ran the airplane out of fuel. And the flight engineer knew that they were running out of fuel and he was what we call hinting and hoping to the captain. And so these were the catalysts for AQP. And what happened was in 1987, the former FAA administrator, T. Allen McCarter, had a task force, and they got together with some of the industry experts that started looking at these human factors accidents. And as a result of that, in September of that year, they started developing the advisory circular and the Federal Register, and the AQP, the Advanced Qualification Program, was born. So, to the question, Advanced Qualification Program is billed as an alternative method to training and evaluating as opposed to 121, training and checking. Its fundamental differences are two things. It uses a methodology called Instructional Systems Design, which is a systems approach to developing training. It's been used in the military for many, many years. It's been used in all other non-aviation domains. And also the empirical validation, statistical analysis to develop the training program. So it's significantly different from 121 in that 121 is what we would call program training. You need to have, X amount of hours of ground school, X amount of hours of flight training, where AQP uses proficiency-based training and it's planned hours. And we could get in a little bit deeper into how we develop it, but that's generally what it is. It's much more user-friendly in terms of scenario-based training, as opposed to, you've all taken the 121 check ride, right? 121 is proficiency-based, strictly just maneuvers-based, skill-based, what we call skill-based training, right? So we all know the deal. We take off, low visibility takeoff, the RNAV departure, do your steep turns and stalls. Get a little bit of a mild non-normal, a pressurization or a bleed fault or something like that. Back around for a non-precision approach to a landing. The sim backs up. The weather goes down. The gross sway goes up. Guess what's happening? V1 cut, right?
Oh, you're
V1
spoiling
cut.
it for our listeners.
Come on, nobody
Sam,
saw
come
that coming.
on.
Well, that's the 121. I'm talking 121, right? So it's been, and over the years, pilots have been very good at taking these check rides, right? Because it's all the cookie cutter approach. But when you throw in a non-normal, the startle effect, like Eastern 401, like United 173, like Palm 90, off of Washington in 1982, they weren't necessarily proficient at managing these non-normals. Assigning a pilot flying, going to the QRH or the ICAS or whatever your airplane. So as a result, the CRM, or what we now call threat and air management, that's the new term, is integrated into all phases of CRM. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about barriers in the observation scale and how we do that, and can get a little bit more detail if you like.
Before we jump into any more, can you just talk a little bit about your specific involvement with AQP and how you've come to be so familiar with everything?
Well, I always had a passion for flight training, even when I was a CFI up in Connecticut back in the 70s and early 80s. I always loved, working with the students, going into the practical test standards and making sure that all my students, I was following the letter of the law and all the maneuvers and everything I was training them for. So I really always had a passion for the science of training. And then as my career progressed, I went to work for one of the Allegheny commuters in Atlantic City, and I became a check airman, and always was involved with training and checking pretty much everywhere I worked. And then I got my bachelor's degree later in life, when I was about 36, and I was living in southern New Jersey, and Embry-Riddle had a College of Continuing Education, and I wanted to work on my master's degree because they had a human factors program there. So I started taking all the coursework for human factors. And about that time, I got hired by Piedmont, which was the commuter Piedmont, the Dash 8s at the time. And they were the one of the first regional airlines to get involved in AQP. And when I went through the Dash 8 training, I got hired to be a check airman right into the training department. I started looking at the documentation, and I was looking at that point for a subject for my graduate research project. They call it a capstone project now at Embry-Riddle. And so I had a light bulb moment. I looked at the documentation, started reading up, and I said, this is the future of aviation training. It might take a while, and it did, but I really, really got excited about it. So I went to my boss, and I said, I want to do my research and paper on AQP. And he organized me to go to the AFS 230, which was the advanced qualification branch. At that time, it's different now. It's under AFS 280. And I got some data, did the data analysis, did all the research. And that's how I got involved. And then, of course, I was a check airman under AQP on the Dash 8. And then later on, after I graduated, I went and I continued my education, and I got a certificate in instructional systems design, which is the principal methodology behind developing and administering AQP, particularly the development side. And then over the years, I was a check airman. I was an APD. I was been on the 190 for about 18 years. And I started developing an AQP program for our commuter at U.S. Airways right after 9/11. And then, long story short, it's a three-bear story, but they disbanded the airline, and I got furloughed again, and then went back to U.S. Airways in 2007 and worked in the training department, worked with AQP documentation. And then when we had the American merger in 2014, I helped to update the documentation for the single certificate, as we were doing the single operating certificate. And then since then, I've been just a check airman APD, administering maneuver validations and LOEs up until I got the COVID-19 retirement last year.
So back to AQP, and you mentioned this ISD, Instructional Systems Design. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how that it kind of develops the course?
Sure. Instructional systems design it's a systems approach to developing training. It uses a lot of disciplines, cognitive psychology and human factors engineering, but basically it's just a methodology for developing training programs. Not necessarily aviation. It has a lot of uses in the military. We're one of the first ones that started it. In fact, there's a landmark study when you start looking into AQP. It's not aviation related, but it really illustrates the point. Back in the 60s, AT&T had a course for their telephone repairmen, and it was 45 days. It cost them quite a few millions of dollars. And they brought in a ISD development team to take a look at it, because an ISD person looks at solving a problem as opposed to a curriculum guy says, well, he focuses on building the curriculum, where an instructional systems design approach looks at solving a problem. They took a look at their program, and they were able to shave 25 days off of content that was completely irrelevant to the job, saving them $37 million over 5 years. So instructional systems design is a systematic method to developing training. We use what's called a task analysis, where we look at all the maneuvers that have to be performed, and we perform what's called a job task analysis. Like, for instance, what are the requirements for an RTO, for a V1 cut, for a non-precision approach, for a precision approach, and for your flows, call-outs. And through that job task analysis, we develop what's called terminal proficiency objectives and supporting proficiency objectives. A lot of times you'll hear the term TPO and SPO thrown around. So we develop those objectives, and based on the individual needs of the airline. One of the significant features about AQP using instructional systems design methodology is that each individual operator can tailor their AQP program not only to their airline in their particular area of operation, but you can also drill down to which particular model of aircraft you're flying. For instance, if you're flying, like, for instance, a 737, or in my case, the Embraer 190, short legs, hour legs maybe, as opposed to, and going into the high-density airports like, LaGuardia, Washington, Boston, versus maybe a 777 or a 787 that are doing one leg across the pond. So you could tailor your job task analysis to each individual fleet, and from there you can develop your program.
So you can customize for each fleet. And also each airline's AQP program is going to look a little bit different too if they've got a specific type of an operation, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. For instance, so if you had an airline like up in Alaska, right, or maybe they're doing a lot of NORDO operations, no radar operations, non-precision approaches. Well, certainly you want to focus on that type of operation. So the beauty of AQP is instead of doing the old cookie cutter 121 where you're just doing the maneuvers based, you could develop scenarios based on your specific operation. I'll give you a case in point. So I was on the Embraer 190 for 18 years, and probably 85% of our flying was the shuttle, New York, Boston, LaGuardia. And so in our training program, we depart LaGuardia, Whitestone climb off of 13, expressway visual of 31, going into Boston, the Roebuck arrival. Everything that we did on the line, we had in our training program. We did the now back down to Atlanta. Most of the time, 27 right, you get a PRM down there if you've been down there. So one of our scenarios, we did the ILS PRM down at 27 in Atlanta. So we actually tailored our training program on the 190 to exactly what the customer or the student is going to see on the line.
Well, that's a novel concept.
Yeah, wow.
Yes.
Amazing it took us that long to come up with that, huh? And then the other thing too, can't you continually tailor it as the operation changes? Not only if you start serving other destinations or a new airplane, but don't you take some of the data from FADAP or FOQA, depending on what acronym and what airline you're using, and get ahead of the trends that we're seeing? Because that was one of the biggest things that I was in new 121, I'd say, versus when Dylan and I originally went to the regionals, it was the old program of,
we're going to Memphis today.
You're going to circle. It's going to be, all the nonsense, which now I remember going and they're like, okay. And they present the data that they're getting and they're going to train these deficiencies that they're seeing before something bad happens. I was like, and that blew me away. I was like, wow, this is the way it's done. Is that a result of AQP or is that something else?
It absolutely is, Max. It's a requirement of AQP. AQP, when it's all said and done, it is a safety-related training program. In fact, it's under the auspices now of AFS 280, which is the Air Carrier Training and Voluntary Systems Program branch. Okay, and that's exactly right. We use FOQA data. We use LOSA data.
What's LOSA?
Line Operational Simulation Audit.
So how do you get that data?
LOSA was started by the gentleman by the name of James Clement in the University of Texas, Austin. And it's basically trained observers that fly in the jump seat. And you can have outside observers, or a lot of airlines will have their own observers. American has their own observers. These are specially trained pilots that ride in the jump seat. They're not necessarily, and in most cases are not, qualified in the airplane that they're observing on. And they're just collecting de-identified data, no jeopardy whatsoever. And they're looking for trends. And then they go back to that data and we can take a look at it and we can see where the deficiencies are, any policies, procedures, flows, any systemic issues that we have. And the trend analysis is done and we put that into the training as well as mitigating any potential threats that are out there. So we use FOQA. I'll give you a great example. Everybody knows about the expressway visual of 31 at LaGuardia. Back in the old days, before we had a lot of FMSs, we did, directed dials, right? 085 heading, follow the LIE, down around, over Home Depot, and on into 31, right? Well, the FOQA data was hitting on a pretty significant number of unstabilized approaches. I know you had a gentleman on there a couple of weeks ago talking about the unstabilized approaches, visual approaches, which, by the way, made my hair stand up, but that's another, with all those unstabilized approaches. But we actually had some issues with unstabilized approaches that was hit by the FOQA data. So we were able to take that data, go to Honeywell, and with the FAA and develop an FMS visual approach for the expressway visual of 31. So now we fly just like an RNAV or an RNAV RNP approach. And it significantly, pretty much eliminated the instances of unstabilized approaches into LaGuardia. So that's one method.
That's it's funny is we did the same thing at the airline I was flying at, where we would do the river visual to DCA, And we used to do that at the regional airline too, where it was truly a visual approach, right? It was visual landmarks and you would fly it. And it was a pretty low turn. If those of you that haven't done it, the turn from base to final, you're well under 1,000 feet, we'll just say.
Well, the thing is, we did the same thing, with, because the 190 going into Washington with the River Vision, we had the same thing. It's all through the FMS. Because, with P56, that's P56 avoid is another issue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So we do it all on the FMS now, and we come right in and
that's
come
the
right
same
over
with
pretty
us.
much with your short final.
And we do the RMP AR approach or arrival or approach, which is the same thing. And it turns you at a nice radius turn to final and the whole deal. But is it ever evaluated as there is a negative for doing that? And I think that force, there's a reliance on automation instead of stick and rudder, looking outside, flying the jet type of skills. Is that something that's addressed when those changes are made via the data in AQP, or is there another approach where they're like, wait a minute, maybe we should be practicing the visual maneuvers so people can hone their skills to be able to fly that more effectively and more stabilized versus the other side, which we've done, which is rely on the automation?
Well, we still practice visual approaches, but going into like Washington, we definitely put a lot of emphasis on doing on using the automation just because of like P56. We've had a lot of, as I'm sure there's been a lot of P56 incursions, particularly on departure off of one, where guys just blew right over the White House, and you get the call from the Secret Service. That's also a training item that we do with P56 avoidance, and we have special procedures that we develop as far as the departure briefing. But we do put emphasis on visual approaches, but we also put a lot of emphasis on using the automation vis-a-vis avoiding unstabilized approaches.
Has there ever been something that was pointed out through AQP or any of these other methods of data collection where it went the other way, where it's people were having problems controlling the airplane, whether it's unstabilized approaches or we're fast or landing long or whatever, and they address it more with less reliance on automation and more on pilot skills, or has that not really been a thing?
Oh yeah. In fact, case in point would be the EET training, right? The enhanced training that we all had to make.
Yeah, that's a really good example.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking the automation off.
For us that don't know, what was that training?
Yeah,
EET,
go ahead.
Enhanced envelope training. Remember the Air France accident? They were going from Brazil to Paris.
Yep.
And they crashed into the ocean because they stalled the airplane and they never recovered. So as a result of that, all the simulators were modified a couple of years ago so that we could do a full stall, and we do the enhanced envelope training now.
Oh,
where we
yes.
actually go up to
It's
altitude and we do the full stall.
Sure.
Upset
Big jet
training.
sim. Yeah.
Gotcha. High altitude stalls, all that.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
all that stuff. Right.
Yeah. So absolutely, there is emphasis put on the actual hand flying. In fact, most of the training programs, you have to do a hand flown single engine ILS still. So you do the first one, like if you did a V1 cut, you do your first approach on the autopilot. Automation level 3 is what we call it, to a missed approach. And then you come back around, and then at the marker, you shut the autopilot off, and then you hand fly it. So there is emphasis on hand flying.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Sam, especially for a lot of our listeners who maybe have been flying corporate and now they're getting into 121 for their first time, or maybe their regional airline didn't have AQP and now they're going to the majors and they're seeing AQP for the first time. Many of us are used to kind of the traditional path. You do your ground school, then maybe you do some cockpit procedure trainer, then you go do the sim, in kind of some type of linear order. And I obviously know every carrier is different, but could you give us a general idea of what it's like for a new hire or somebody new to the program, what it would look like to train under AQP?
Well, the structure is basically the same, but understand that each individual airline can modify it to the way that they want to do it. But typically on most AQP programs, of course, if you're a new hire, you'd have your basic in-doc. That really hasn't changed. But when we get into the systems part, it's a combination of computer-based training, for an example, and you might have half of the day doing CBT on each particular system. And then you would transition into the IPT and do 4 hours of procedures training, whether it's an IPT or it might be an FTD, flight training device. But we would start off with a cold airplane and just go through the checklist and power it up and hit all the switches on the overhead panel. And that's basically about it. We get away from all the typical build the airplane methodology. So it's all operationally oriented. And we're going to go through that all 10 days. And we're going to be asking you and reviewing all the lights and switches on the overhead panel, the forward panel, etc. And then at the end on your systems and procedures validation, we're just going to validate the knowledge. We're going to ask you the same things that we've been talking about for the last 10 days. It's as simple as that. And, if you think about it, guys, in the heat of the battle, when you're up there at 350, 6 months out of training, and all of a sudden you get a TRU fail light, are you going to remember, well, the TRU is connected to this bus or that bus? No, you're going to go to the QRH. One guy's going to, my aircraft, your aircraft, one person's going to fly. The other person's going to pull out the QRH or go to the ICAS or whatever your airplane is. And you're going to have what we call a document solution. You're going to go to the document and you're going to solve the problem, and away you go. So we get away from all that build the airplane stuff. And at the end of the day, we have what we call a systems and procedures validation. It's not your traditional oral. And once you pass that and go through that validation, that's called a gate under AQP. And then we transition into the simulator. Generally on a 10-day footprint, days 1 through 5 would be basically maneuvers-based training. You still have to do your V1 cuts, your RTOs, your different approaches, evacuation, stuff like that. But when you do your maneuver validation, all those items are validated. And once the maneuver validation is complete, you're done with all that. No more V1 cuts, no more RTOs or anything. The maneuvers validation it's not a check ride. It's a validation of what we call the train to proficiency concept. It's scenario-based train to proficiency. So, and you can repeat things. If one maneuver isn't quite up to standard, you can repeat up to 2 maneuvers. You can repeat one maneuver twice, or you can do up to 3 different repeats on different maneuvers before we say, hey, we need to go back and maybe do some more training.
Is it kind of like when you can phone a friend on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Sort of, you get a little couple extra.
Say it's that. I would say, if for instance, if I was doing an MV and on a new hire on a qualification MV, and we did a V1 cut and it was on a tolerance, I would say, hey, Max, what do you think about that? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to say, oh man, I got way off by center line. I say, well, let's try it again, and we would do a repeat, and then that would be fine. Usually it would be fine. So we can repeat maneuvers on a qual MV. So it's a gentleman's course. And then once the MV is successful, then we start going into some loft type scenarios where we have, like you would fly from point A to B with different, kind of like just like a loft. Mm-hmm. And then we would have prior to LOE, we would have your actual loft line-oriented flight training, which is usually 2 legs. And then your LOE is your line operational evaluation. That's what you would call your type ride. And it's just conducted just like a loft, except there's no training. It's just an evaluation event. So the check airman with a pair crew, generally captain, first officer, and you would have 2 scenarios. Like the 190, our leg 1 was LaGuardia, Boston. Load the MCDU, taxi out, 1-3, Whitestone climb, direct merit, Roebuck arrival, maybe a TCAS thrown in, and then as you were starting your descent, what we call a green non-normal, maybe a ADS failure, a bleed light, something like that. Go to the QRH, solve the problem, and continue to land the RNAV 27 to Boston. Take a break, 15 minutes, back in. Now the captain flies Boston to Philadelphia, and we take off like the Sox or the Pats departure, maybe do a reroute, a TCAS RA, and maybe a little bit of turbulence, have to change altitude. And they're just flying a normal flight, just working as a crew. And then at some point on the way into Philadelphia, you would get one of 3, what we call red triggers. You might get a IDG failure or an engine failure or low oil pressure, which would result in an engine shutdown, and have to land single engine in Philadelphia and taxi to the gate and type up your certificates. So
that sounds better than flying around Memphis for 2 hours straight.
Yeah, no, I don't want to make it sound like overly easy, but it's a much more, in my opinion, it's a much more user friendly way to train.
Yeah, that just sounds so much better.
Well, it is, and one of the things that was referenced is the Southwest where the fan blades let loose, and it was an engine, catastrophic engine failure with a depressurization. That's a scenario that had been trained previously.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so, and that's one of those things that you could see very easily in AQP or something, right? Where it's a situation like that where you have a system failure that affects another system, and then it makes
yes.
sense.
Now we, as a rule, we don't do multiple failures. Like we won't give a guy an engine failure and then fail the IDG. We don't load up, and we don't do Easter egg hunts and all that stuff. No, we're strictly about training. We always had a philosophy. We say we're not the checking department. We're the training department. And a good AQP program, it's not designed like that. It's all scenario based and specific to your airplane in theory, and just like you're flying the line. When the student finishes his LOE and gets his type rating and comes out to one of us for their LOE, it's just another extension. It's another what we call a training gate. The AQP uses what they call gates. So like your systems and procedures validation is a gate you have to pass through, or a door, if you will. Your maneuver validation is a gate. Your LOE is a gate. And finally, your OE is a gate.
Now, let me ask you this. Back when I was doing training as a first officer, we had to go back and we would do recurrent once a year. And it was a really high pressure and, quite frankly, high stakes event, especially for when you're on probation. I mean, it's basically, hey, here you go back. We're going into a class for maybe half a day, and then you're doing an oral, which is an exam, and then you're doing a simulator. And by the way, you haven't practiced this in a year. Good luck. And, it was nerve-wracking. I would say that was probably one of the most challenging things, I would say, as a probationary pilot, going
most
through
stressful,
that.
for
Yeah,
sure.
Incredibly stressful. What does a recurrent look like in AQP? Is it the same time? Like, is it once every 12 months? And is there a lot of pressure? Can you talk about that at all?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, you're in for a pleasant surprise. Under AQP, we don't use the term recurrent. Now, it depends on the operator, but let's look at it in terms of continuing qualification, okay? A continuing qualification, usually it's about 3 days. First day you come into the training center and you go through a ground school. And now this is the way we did it. Now, again, qualifier, other airlines might be different. But we have like 12 systems. So every year we do 4 systems. Okay. So you might do 4 systems one year, 4 systems the next year, and the evaluation cycle. As far as how often, that is based on the performance data. Most AQP programs start out with you come into the simulator every year. It's what they call a 2-year evaluation cycle at 24 months. So let's establish that you come in every year. So day 1 would be a ground school. You go down and, you go down and hit Bob on the nose and all the smoke, fire extinguisher, all that stuff, what we call non-aircraft specific. And you'd have a day of your ground school. The second day is a simulator, and we go in for what's called a maneuvers observation. And it's all training. There's no checking on that day. Okay. So basically, it's very similar to the maneuvers validation that we do on your initial. So you start off, try to remember this from memory now. You paired crew, theoretically, captain, first officer. You might start off with first maneuver is a RNAV departure. You'll each do an RNAV departure. And once you take off and you climb the altitude and you've intercepted the RNAV course, we stop the sim, put it back on the ground, let the first officer do his or her RNAV departure. And then up next would be we reposition you out to 3 miles from the runway. We're going to set up and brief a Cat 3 approach. So we'll do a Cat 3 approach to a missed approach. And in our airline, captains only fly the Cat 3, and the first officer has his Autoline 1 green call, his whatever call out you use. And then back around for another Cat 3 to a landing. And then we each get a V1 cut. And let's say the captain does his V1 cut, take off, come back around. You do a coupled approach to a missed approach, back around for your second approach, hand flown, shut the autopilot off at the marker and land. And then we bring it back up, but we do a no flat slap approach, and then followed by an RNAV RNP and a 2-2 in LaGuardia. And it's strictly training. If a maneuver is not satisfactory or doesn't meet the standard, we do it over. We train it. The only limitation you have on a continuing qualification maneuvers observation is if you run out of sim time. That's the only limitation we have. So you can repeat a V1 cut. We can do a little training. We can repeat any maneuver until the proficiency standards have been met, and then we continue on. So day 3 is another LOE. And we have in our airline, well, we were doing one leg towards the end. So you get to pick, or the check airman would pick, we're going to go from, let's say, Philadelphia to Boston. And it would be kind of like your call LOE. We would take off. We do the Philadelphia, whatever it is now, I forgot, departure, head up to Boston, do the Roebuck. You might hold over Providence. And while you're in the holding pattern, you'll have maybe a pressurization failure, ADS failure, some type of non-normal. And it's all about using your threat and air management. It doesn't matter who started off flying the airplane. If the captain decides, because in our airline, once you have a non-normal, we let the first officer fly the airplane, and the captain manages a non-normal. That's normally the way we train. So let the first officer fly the airplane, and the captain manages. So just like you want on the line. It's not one of these, it's my leg, I got to fly because the check airman's got to watch me. It's totally using threat and air management just the way you would on the line. And that's it. And that's your CQ. We'll see you next year.
And they publish a guide too. Don't they publish a guide beforehand that you can kind of get a brief on before you even show up to the training center?
We have our own website in our airline, and you can go in there and you can get the same PowerPoint presentation that the check airman is going to brief you on. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And we have videos now, like if you want to watch, we had a video for like a V1 cut, rejected takeoff, etc. Yeah.
And then part of 2 is the, like at my airline, we had training every quarter that you'd have to complete on your iPad and watch videos and stuff, and you get paid for it and the whole deal. But that's all, you're kind of continuously always training instead of coming and just having one training 3 days a year. You're kind of always in training is a way to look at it, right?
We have the same thing. We have quarterly distance learning, and I think we're paid at 50% of your hourly rate. So what you're paid for that, and of course you have to complete it, because if you go past the deadline, then you go non-qual. So that's basically the way it works. Now, can I just talk about the data for a second, because it's really important? Okay. So a lot of guys get hung up about the grading, the quote unquote grading scale. We use what's called a 5-point observation scale, and this is how pilots are graded. But it's very important to understand that this data is de-identified. It's not attributed. It's not tied to Max and Dylan. It's used for curriculum development and just continually monitoring the program and looking for trends. And that data is de-identified, and it's sent to the FAA. So at the end of the day, the FAA needs to know that, Max and Dylan are up or down, but the other data that we collect and we record is de-identified, and we look at it every year, and we look at the trends, and we make the changes to the program. So let me give you an example. Let's take, for example, a paired crew, captain, first officer, and the maneuver in question is a CAF 3 to a missed approach. So we'll say the captain's the pilot flying, first officer is the pilot monitoring, and they execute the approach, and they're course alive, glide slope alive, set missed approach altitude, minimum call, all their call outs they're right on the money. So at the end of that maneuver, the evaluator would grade that a 5, which we call error free. All right. So same maneuver, this time with glide slope intercept, the captain forgets to call set missed approach altitude. The first officer says, "Hey, Max, how about if I set you missed approach altitude?" "Oh, yeah, great, thanks." They continue on, do the maneuver, go around, no problem. So we'll grade that at 4. Okay. Was it error-free? No. But it was error-trapped. It was a crew-trapped error. Okay. Same scenario. This time, glide slope intercept, said missed approach. The captain forgets to call for missed approach altitude. The first officer might be task loaded. He might have just got call from 8. He's checking in with the tower. He misses the call. So the missed approach altitude doesn't get set. But they go to minimums, missed approach. No problem. It's not consequential. So was it error-free? No. Was it crew-trapped? No. Was it not trapped? Yes. So we would grade that a 3. And that would be what we call we would debrief to standard. most of the time you'd say, hey, guys, how did that go? Oh, man, I forgot to set the missed approach altitude. You're not going to make a guy repeat a maneuver because what's the chances of him doing that, making that same mistake again, right?
Right. It's a waste of time.
It's called the cognitive skill versus the psychomotor skill. That's a whole nother area. But so fourth scenario, same thing happens this time when they go around, they blow through the altitude because it was never set. So now we would grade that as a 2 because safety was compromised. And again, it depends on what the maneuver is, but the check airman can debrief the standard, or if it was something like a V1 cut or a control issue, we'd say, hey, let's go ahead and do that again, and we would grade that a 2. Okay? So, and on the observation scale. So when we grade something like a 2 or a 3, then we have what we call reason codes. Well, what was it? Well, why did the first officer miss that call out? Well, he was task loaded. That's an additive condition. Or why did that V1 cut go south? Well, he aircraft control, vertical control, lateral control, whatever. So we delineate that with reason codes, and then we look at the trends in the data. Like I can remember one instance, we had first officers were missing a required call out on an RTO. And we saw that consistently over time, a constant repeat for missing the call out. So we adjusted the program, added another sim period, and that's how we made the adjustment. So that's basically when you hear about the data, some people get a little bit concerned because they think, well, the FAA is going to know that I had to repeat my V1 cut or something like that. No, it's all de-identified and it's used to enhance the program.
It's funny listening to all of this. You hear about so much of analytics in sports and the stock market, everything. And it's what people say, like big data. And we're harnessing this in training now. And that's really cool to hear. And especially you get that unique perspective at an airline where everyone's trained on the same manual and the same call outs and procedures. So you can really track a lot of that.
What a novel concept. You use a systematic approach to develop the training and you use statistical analysis to validate the training. I mean, what a concept, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of cool because Dylan and I, coming from an airline, and then I went from being a Part 91 2-pilot operation to the airline, then back to the 2-pilot Part 91 operation, and then ultimately back to the airline. And those, I think, are probably the two ends of the spectrum, right? So at the airline, you have all this help, I guess, of how they identify deficiencies. When everybody's doing, there's all this preponderance of data. You're doing thousands of flights a day, and they can see all this, and they can train out. Part 91, there's nobody else watching. And we always talk about the responsibility of you watching yourself and being critical of yourself and being honest with yourself to see where you're coming up short and taking steps to do that. And that's essentially what AQP does for you, which is very nice.
And if I could just point out, I don't know whether any of your listeners would be interested, but I didn't want to pass up an opportunity to talk about some documentation. If anybody would really like to read up on it, or you might have some people out there that are considering trying to develop their program. Okay. Yeah. So the gold standard is Advisory Circular 12054 Alpha. It's about 160 something pages. You go onto the FAA.gov website and get that. And that basically will just tell you everything you want to need to know about AQP. That's the document. It's kind of dry, but there's a wealth of information there. And that's the source document for the guidance. And also there's on the FAA.gov website, there's the Flight Standards Management Information System, 8910. That's the same document that the FAA uses, right? It's Volume 3, Chapter 21, and there's 5 sections there, all on AQP. And the first section is a really, really nice, what I would call a 30,000-foot view of AQP. It'll talk about, the trained and proficiency concept. I think I mentioned to you, Dylan, yesterday, the qualification standards document that's developed in phase 2 of AQP replaces the airman certification standards. Okay, so think about that. For all intents and purposes, each individual airline develops their own airman certification standards, and we call it the qualification standards document. Okay, so that document, the 8910, is a really great document because frankly, the one misconception about AQP over the years is what I like to call the 121 paradigm. Us guys, that have a little gray hair, been around a while, we were all brought up on that 121 model. And traditionally, that's all we've had. It was the only game in town for so many years, right? So along comes AQP, and they decide, hey, this airline, we're going to switch into AQP. So they get all the check airmen together and they say, well, we're going into AQP. Well, what do? Well, not surprisingly, because, we're human beings, they're creatures of habit. A lot of AQP programs at the beginning started looking like, surprisingly enough, a 121 program, But so I would encourage anybody that is really interested in learning about it, particularly if you're going to be developing it, to go into those documentation and try to have a good look at it and try to say, you know what, I don't have to follow the 121 model. I can develop this program specific to my airline, specific to the aircraft that we're flying and the routes that that particular aircraft.
What was the initial reaction when AQP first came on the scene? Were pilots or training departments, were they resistant? Did they like it, or what was the deal?
Huge resistance. First of all, one of the big resistance was, see, under AQP, if I did a maneuver validation on you two guys, let's say you're going through our course, and then a week later you're finished the rest of the training and you go up for your LOE, well, you'd have a different examiner. You'd have an APD then, see, Aircrew Program Designee, that would issue you the type rating. Well, in the beginning, guys would say, well, what do you mean I'm going to issue this guy a type rating and I didn't watch him do his V1 cut or his RTO? That's the 121 mentality, you see? So there was a lot of resistance like that. I had a conversation with someone there not too long ago who worked for a freight carrier. And they said, oh, those guys, AQP, that's for guys that can't fly, that's for wussies, And it's a lot of misconception there because it doesn't fit the paradigm of traditional 121 training. 121 training has been around for so long. There's some very strongly held paradigms, and there was a lot of resistance. Now it's getting a lot better. In my opinion, there's still a lot of airlines that aren't using the full benefits that's afforded to them under a robust AQP program.
Yeah, it'll be interesting as we read FOQA and things are coming to 135 operators and business jets. And once you really have to have the data to make AQP work, right, Sam?
Well, it's a requirement.
Yeah, so once this data collection ability comes, I think that would be really good for a lot of operators, especially because some of the operations are higher risk than I would say, a lot like some of the mountain airports and all this stuff, and to do that data-driven training is going to be really big for that segment.
Well, yeah, you mentioned like for instance, Eagle's a great example. Now, we didn't go out to Eagle on the 190, but the 757 does. We have a special training segment for Eagle, and that's the beauty of AQP is you can tailor it. If you have a particular airport, like for instance, Washington. Washington's a perfect example. P-56 avoidance. You got to really be on your game going out of Washington. You got to be on your game going in out of LaGuardia, And so that's the beauty of it. You can tailor it to your specific operation.
Yeah, that'll be nice. And you can do that now in business jet training, but the responsibility is on you to take the initiative to do it and sign up for these courses or do the Aspen training or to use your sim time to go fly into some of these areas beyond the bare requirements. So, which
are the business jets using FOQA?
It's coming. I don't think anywhere's active yet, right?
The problem is it's not. There's a million different operators. So how can you aggregate data? So, and I think this is what we'll have to look at is the next generation of business aviation training. I could see because the training providers are almost going to have to be the ones to aggregate the data. And you wonder if when you go to flight safety or Simuflight, if they'll say, hey, do you want to opt into our new data driven program?
For an extra $10,000.
For an extra, X amount of dollars. Don't steal that, flight safety, if you heard me. But something like that where they can take their big fleet data from NetJets and FlexJet and some of the bigger operators and say, hey, your type is, you don't operate with that fleet, but maybe you could train up to or use some of their data to improve your training.
It'll be more challenging to implement.
It's going to be way more challenging than an airline. But
FlexJet is actually AQP, and a lot of the former guys over U.S. Airways went over there to do it. So I want to mention one more document if I have time.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to put a link on the show notes for the podcast for all the documents you mentioned. So yeah, you can just mention the document and we'll have a link for it.
You're asking me about ISD, Instructional Systems Design, and the FAA recognized early on that check airmen developing these programs weren't necessarily experts in instructional systems design. So they put out a document. It's a little dated. I think it came out in 1997, but it's called the Applied Instructional Systems Design and AQP Development. And you can Google it. And if somebody wants to learn a little bit about the process and help them with their development.
Sam, I have a question I've been waiting to ask this whole interview. Yeah. So would you say that the sign at the American Airlines Training Center that says "through these doors pass the best trained crews in the world" is primarily due to AQP, or is that just because you guys are awesome?
Well, when I first I'm in Charlotte, so I'm a U.S. Air guy, so I started, with the training center in Charlotte. The first time I went to Dallas and I saw that, I don't think I'll repeat what I said, but I actually took a picture. I actually took a picture of that on my cell phone. In fact, I could probably find it, but I actually have a picture of that. And I think that was up well before AQP.
Oh, yeah. It's so funny. I mean, so Max and I both went to American Eagle. That was our first job right out of flight instructing. And we train at the American Airlines facility there at DFW. So we walked through that door and I was like 22 years old.
I'm like, what?
And I'm like, well, they don't mean me.
Well,
no, that's the main line.
So were you guys at Envoy?
Yes, it was called
Envoy
American Eagle at the time.
Yeah.
Yep. And then we would do all the training.
Well, now they got the flow through, and
right.
They're throwing buckets of money at these guys now.
Yeah.
You probably saw all
It's
that.
incredible. I think listening to this, I just timed it. I was doing JEP revisions. I was doing the double jeopardy check rides. I was doing the, no cell phone. I mean, it was just like the worst time to be at an airline.
Yeah.
Now
right.
it's so much better.
It is.
And making $20,000 a year. But so Sam, all this experience you've had training, watching people mess up in simulators, I imagine you've just seen pretty much everything. You've got to have some good stories for us. What do you got?
Well, I have a lot of good stories, but I think one that comes to mind that was kind of funny is I was doing OE with a new hire, and this gentleman came right out of the Air Force, and he flew C-17s, and like a lot of the new hires we get, he had never flown a civilian aircraft before. And as luck would have it, his first leg OE was going into LaGuardia. And so we were pushing back, taxiing out, and we were 17th for departure. And ATC was showing the usual New York love, and there was a corporate 190, and he wasn't familiar, and he was missing the instructions, and he wasn't reading back, and they told him to hold short of the merge, and he didn't know what it was. And it's extremely busy, as only LaGuardia can be. And this poor guy, I'm looking over at him in the right seat, and he is just white as a ghost. And the controllers are just rapid fire, hollering at this guy because he's missing his instructions. And he turns to me and he said, "Sam, I've done 3 tours in Iraq. I would rather be over there right now."
That's awesome.
So that's the G-rated story I can tell.
That's funny. Dylan and I always talk about, I think we both did IOE out of Chicago, right?
Yeah.
And I remember you pull up and they'd read this taxi clearance. You'd have your pen and your paper. You're all ready. And you didn't write one thing down.
No.
I remember you just looked to the left at the captain like, "What?" And he goes, "Don't worry, I got it. 3-2 left, Tango 10, Alpha, follow the United." They make me like, I have no idea what's going on.
I started going into LaGuardia in 1983, and I really do love it. I'm from not too far away from there, up north in Connecticut, and I really enjoyed it. that was probably my favorite airport. It's just the buzz, you can't beat it,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it does take getting used to. You got to know your way around.
It's so I'll never forget that. I was jump seating on Southwest, and they were doing OE for another military pilot, and I just remember like my mind being blown because incredible, like flew the airplane amazingly, but just like the radio transmission just couldn't grasp like, do I call for pushback? Do they, and it was just
What's
funny.
Metering?
Yeah. It was just like all these things that we take for granted. They've done incredible things in airplanes and that I could never imagine to do in civilian flying, but just some of the basics. It's just funny how that works.
And we don't want to get a lot of nasty grams from your listeners because we're certainly not ragging on them, but they are in a totally different environment.
It's a different world.
And it's just, you compared to a civilian guy that's been, back in the day, we had to call it on and off times and all that to work. It's just a totally different environment.
And I imagine bringing it all in full circle, AQP's got to be a great asset for a lot of our military pilots that are coming in. I imagine that makes things easier for them, right?
It certainly makes things easier because we do it all. We simulate the ACARs in the simulator. push back, like Philadelphia, push back LaGuardia in the alleyways. I mean, you have to contact ramp for pushing it out. We don't even single engine taxi in New York because it's so all those different, they're airport specific procedures. So it really does help them a lot. But still, when you're out there in the heat of the battle and for real, and it's such a dynamic environment that it takes them a while. But usually after, a few legs, they're kind of picking up the pace. I always used to tell don't put a guy in LaGuardia on his first leg. Let's go out to Minneapolis or down to Atlanta. Or something.
I'm sure that was scheduling's first concern.
Yeah, well, they did it. They did it a lot, and you want to give the guy a little chance to take a breather, and you get up to altitude and get your coffee and just talk about some things instead of just Boston LaGuardia, particularly when you're going from Boston and they're landing on 22. I mean, it's a 30-minute flight.
Oh yeah, my first flight ever in a jet was from O'Hare to Kalamazoo, Michigan, which is literally right across from Lake Michigan. It's like a 20-minute flight. I remember that. The first flight ever in a real jet. I was holding on to the tail.
My first landing in a jet ever was at DCA.
Oh, really?
Brilliant. I don't know why they did. Anyways, well, Sam, I speak on behalf of all of the pilots out there. Thank you for being one of the pioneers in these programs, and it's so incredible. I'm actually really jealous right now.
It's an actual bona fide contribution to aviation safety, because it is. Coming from not doing this type of training for so long and doing it, I was like, wow, this makes a lot more sense than anything I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, take a look at those documents, particularly when you start your training, and they'll give you a little bit of an idea of what what you're in for. And someday you might even be an AQP manager.
Hey, man, and thanks again for having part in training the best trained crews in the world. That's a real accomplishment. Good for you.
No comment.
All right. Well, we'll have the links to all the documents that Sam mentioned in the show notes.
Sam, you went through number 2, 3, 4, and 5, but what's at number 1? Is that red screen?
Actually, that's the failure. But that's a failure in that what I saw in the sim in those 4 hours, I can't fix.
Oh, okay. All right. Got it. Now I won't have to call when I get a 1. Now I know.
Very rarely happen. But listen, reach out to me anytime, and any of your listeners, if they ever want some information or something, I'm retired now, got all the time in the world. I'll be happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks, you so much, Sam.
Appreciate it.
Okay, gentlemen, take care.
Well, thanks so much to Sam for joining us, and really, I would call that a knowledge bomb. Just boom.
Yeah, he's the guy.
Yeah,
has a passion for training.
Yeah, it was awesome. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Harvey Watt and Advanced Aircrew Academy. For more information about all of their offerings for professional pilots, you can check out our show notes. We've got links for everything. Don't forget to check out those can coolers on social media. $60 on the donate page, and one of them can be yours. There's only a couple, so act quickly.
What else?
I don't know what else is going on in the next couple of weeks. You know what we're going to be talking about next? For once, we actually know in advance.
What's that? You do.
Oh, yeah, because you weren't in this interview. We're going to be talking about one of the airline pathway programs.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Is this you and Roy together, unsupervised? That scares me,
fully unsupervised. That's coming up.
I'm not sure about that. Did you guys get into any, real geeky stuff?
100%.
Did you really?
I mean,
come on.
It's unbelievable.
Any sort of playing card games? Were those mentioned?
No, I don't think so.
Meme stuff?
Some. Yeah. But he did a really good job of breaking down the Propel program from Delta. It's an amazing deal. What's available to students in college right now. Just leave it at that. You're going to have to listen to it so I can get your live reaction.
God, I tell you, the next 30 years is going to be real interesting. It's going to become easier for anyone to be an airline pilot until all of a sudden they don't need us anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're going to be poof, back to flight instructing.
Piloting is recreational only.
Recreational only in nature. But then we'll be able to fly with like Donovan Batiste, and he's so happy.
Dude, it was funny. We were driving with the other pilot and I. We were in the car. I'm like, in like 30 or 40 or 50 years, I said, in 50 years, people are going to look back at this job and just laugh and shake their heads how ridiculous it was that it required 2 of us to fly somebody somewhere, and then we would just hang out and spend their money on food and hotels and driving around in a rental car. And then people would be like, what? That actually happened? Like, that was a thing?
Yeah, I know. So you'll have that interview to look forward to in a couple of weeks. But until then, remember,
flexibility.
It's the key to air power. See you guys.
Vanguard.
The statements made in this show are our own opinions and do not reflect, nor were they under any direction from any of our employers.